Today I wanted to try something a little bit different. I'm not doing an over voice for the beginning of this video just so that I can explain what's going on before I get into it. Today I have obviously got these two very similar, not identical pictures that I've drawn. I drew this one first and then I used the method of tracing it with my iPad in Procreate, and then I put this watercolor paper over the top of my iPad and traced it onto this paper so that I could get them as identical as possible. And the reason for that is because today I want to do a comparison between these two types of different watercolor paper. The first type that I have is, I don't know how to pronounce the name correctly, so forgive me for this, but I'll show you it as well. It's called Heraldo di Paolo rough watercolor paper. It's 300 GSM, 100% cotton and acid free, and it's A5. Now I cut it a little bit down to size. It's this one on the left here. I cut it a little bit down to size because the one on the right was 5x7 and I wanted them to be closer in size. Now it says rough watercolor pad. It doesn't say whether it's hot or cold press, but because it's rough, I'm assuming it's cold press, although it really has not that much texture, but in comparison to this one on the right, which is hot press, it's got more texture. So I'm not sure, it just says rough. It could be hot press, could be cold press. I'm assuming it's cold press. So this is the pad that the one from the left is from. And I just got it from my local art and craft store. I shop at Riot Art and Craft. I got it a while ago now. I've done a couple of pieces on this type of paper. This painting that I've done in a previous video was done on this kind of paper, and I noticed while I was doing this painting that you could see the texture. I don't know if you can tell on camera, but you can see the texture. There's a little bit of splotchiness on the skin, on the background, things like that, and I wanted to see if that was because of the paper or because of the methods that I was using. So I wanted to do a direct comparison with these two. So that's the first type of paper. And the other paper is one that I've heard recommended by lots and lots of artists on YouTube. Almost every single watercolor artist that I've heard has used this Strathmore watercolor paper. This one is called Strathmore Ready Cut Watercolor. It's hot press and it is 5x7 inches. It's also 300 GSM or 140 pounds. It's also 100% cotton, acid free, and it says archival as well. And that's this one on the right here. So that's the packaging, I guess. It's just a sheet that came with it, but yeah, just in case you wanted any of that information, there it is. This one I bought online. I got it from Amazon and I can't remember how much it was, but it was decently expensive. And the first one that I showed you, the Heraldo di Paolo, I believe was something like $10. I got it on special. So the Strathmore one is more expensive. It's hot press, definitely. It says it on the packaging, so I know. I thought the smoother texture might help with the patchiness that I've been experiencing, but I wasn't sure. So I have also done another piece, this one that I did in the video last week, and this one I really liked. I didn't think that it turned out as patchy, but I also didn't do a big background that I might have noticed it in, and it is a smaller size, so it wasn't definitive. So that's why I wanted to do the comparison today. I'll probably start with the Heraldo di Paolo because I have a pretty good idea of how that one works. I've used it plenty of times before and I kind of know what to expect from it. So that's the one I'm going to be doing first, and then we'll move to this one, and then at the end I'll show you the end results and I will let you know which one I prefer, and I'll link everything that I used today in the description box below in case you wanted to try any of it. Okay, over to voiceover Mick.
It's alright. Hush.
Alright, so like I said, starting off with the Heraldo di Paolo paper, I have begun with a clear wash of water. This is in order to hopefully produce a smoother finish for the skin, and I did this on both paintings. I was trying to replicate everything that I was doing in order to make it as similar as possible. So I did this for all of the skin. I didn't do it for the hair, the background, or the shirt that she's wearing, but yeah. If you get bored by watching people paint skin, this probably isn't the video for you. I do lots and lots of layers for her complexion, especially on the first painting. And I did notice as well, I don't know if you can see them, but there's a dot between her eyes, and I think that that's a bit of the paper pilling up. I got really frustrated with this. I even tried to remove it at one point, but it kind of just went away as the paper dried, and I'm not entirely sure why.
Sometimes I can't tell if my body belongs to me. I love everything. Fire spread.
You can see it forming a little bit more now as well. 3 dots across her nose, in her eyebrows, or just to the right of her eyebrows. as I lay it on paint. And I think this could be due to the fact that maybe I didn't wait long enough for the paper to dry. I'm not sure if that was the case, but yeah, I can't explain it. It just went away. And again, this is the Arelda di Paolo, so it's the rough watercolor paper. So I wonder if it was just picking up the texture because it was wet, and like it's not just on the camera either. Like it's not just something the camera was picking up. It was something I could see in person, something I was trying to get rid of, and something I thought was getting worse and worse. But yeah, as the paper dried, you'll see it just sort of goes away. So what I'm doing here is just adding some blush and diluting it by scrubbing the page, adding a little bit of clear water.
Just wanna be carefree lately, yeah. Just kicking up daisies. Got one too many quarters in my pockets. Counting like the four-leaf clovers in my locket.
So you might have noticed a technique that I've been doing throughout the course of this video, and basically what it is that I will lay down a wash of colour and then I will go back, clean the brush, wipe it off on a piece of paper towel, so it's not completely dry but it is still damp and it's clean, and you go back to that wash of colour that you put down, and across the edges you sort of just drag the clean brush along the edge of it, and that softens it and helps it to blend a little. This is a technique that I learned from Emily Artful. She calls it the wash and pull technique, but also says that it doesn't really have a name in watercolour, and it's similar to the way that tattoo artists create flash art, and they use it to create depth and shadows in their pieces. Now, I'm still kind of a beginner with, like I've said before, I'm still a beginner with watercolour, but I'm also kind of a beginner painter. I'm more of a sketch artist, which is, I suppose, a little bit surprising or confusing considering the content that I've put out so far on my YouTube channel. But one of my goals with YouTube was to paint more and to get more comfortable painting. But again, I would still consider myself a beginner with it, and understanding where light and shadows fall is one of the things that I have a lot of trouble with. I have done a lot of work with references and trying to use those, but because my style isn't super realistic, that isn't always helpful. I used a reference for this piece for a sketch, but I decided to try and go on my own for the painting process. So some of the shadows and light in this, I don't know if they're exactly accurate. So basically what I'm saying is don't use this as a tutorial, and I've already said before that I'm not really the kind of person that you should look to for tutorials. But yes, I'm not certain of the accuracy of the shadows, but I am kind of happy with how it turned out. I like how the 3/4 view of her face turned out and how the shadow falls over her cheek. And I like it even more in the second painting, so maybe I should have waited until then to talk about it. So here I'm creating the sheen of the hair, and basically that just includes darkening the rest of the hair and pulling it towards the lighter part where where I assumed that light might be. I didn't actually check the reference photo for this, and I did it a little bit differently on the second painting as well.
Why can't you just let me eat my weight in glee? I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in their cradles, profanities. Some days I feel skinnier than all the other days. Sometimes I can't tell if my body belongs to me.
4 layers of paint on the skin. I know it's probably boring at this point and maybe I should cut it out. I don't know. But something I wanted to mention about the skin, especially while we're looking at it here, is that all the shading and painting and stuff that I did on her skin, it looks okay on her face, I think, with the texture of the paper, but I really didn't like, or at least I really preferred how the second painting turned out because of the texture on the paper when it comes to the complexion of her chest and shoulders and neck. On this Arelda di Paolo, it really, I don't know, it like blends out and looks more, I don't know the word for it, it looks less defined. It doesn't look as crisp, it looks bleedy, I guess. I don't know how to explain, but yeah, that's the main reason that I really prefer the hot press watercolor paper. And after I filmed this video, actually, I bought some Araldo di Paolo hot press watercolor paper. So I want to try that out and see if it makes any difference. So I'm just doing the lines here and I'm using the same technique as I did for my previous video. Basically I'm using a damp brush and I'm dipping into the palette for a really saturated amount of the color. This can make it dry a little bit slower and a little bit thicker. It took a long time for the line art around her mouth to dry, so something to consider if that's what you want to do. I know another option is using acrylic inks, which might be more beneficial, but this is the art supply that I have available, so I tried to use it to the best of my ability, and yeah, I don't mind how it turned out. I don't mind the extra wait time for it to dry, and I like it.
I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in the cradles, profanities. I see the world through eyes covered in ink and bleach. Cross out the ones who heard my cries and watched me weep. I love that.
Then I'm just going through using a Posca pen for the highlights. So I go through and do this on the lips, her cheekbones, her collarbones, and her eyes. And I also go through and do that on the hair. Finally, here we are with the peel pawn. I really love that crisp edge. And I had considered colouring or painting in those edges of the shoulders to break the border, but in the end I decided to just erase them. So here is the final product. She's a little bit patchy, but overall I don't hate the painting. I think that it looks okay. It certainly looks like it's been made with watercolour on watercolour paper, and yeah. And I just wanted to show you also a shot of how the paper warped. It didn't warp very much. It was still a little bit, so you can see the edges have lifted there. But that can be solved quite easily. You can put it in a frame, or you can be like me and just not care about it too much. Okay, so now we're moving on to the next piece, and this is on the Strathmore hot press watercolor paper. And again, I'm putting down a clear wash of water, and I almost forgot to do that, so that's why it was kind of a little bit tainted with the fleshy tone on her forehead when I started. But yeah, I kind of scrubbed that up, removed the color as much as I could, and then just went over with a clear wash. So I'm doing that again, going through the flesh tone, which is slightly different than the other painting, mostly because I wasn't sure what direction I wanted to go in. I wasn't sure if I wanted to give her a deeper or a fairer skin tone, and I think that this one turned out a little bit fairer, not necessarily intentionally, but just because that's how the mixture turned out. And that's another thing I guess that I should mention is that, like I keep saying, I'm a beginner watercolorist, I'm a beginner painter, and I'm not sure exactly how to mix skin tones. So this Regina's watercolor palette that I'm using is a fantastic palette for somebody like me. It has a lot of pre-mixed colors and I love them. However, it also presents the problem of when I do want to mix a color that isn't included in the palette, I'm not sure which shades and tones to use to achieve what I'm looking for. For example, I wasn't sure if I should use the lighter yellow or the darker yellow when I wanted a base for a skin tone. I kind of had an idea that yellow and red would come up with a sort of fleshy tone, but I wasn't sure what else to add to it to not make it super orange. And so I even had to Google how to mix a skin tone with watercolor. So that's what I did, and I found out that you meant to add a dot of blue, but there are like 5 blues in this palette, so I wasn't sure which one to use. And I found that every time I tried a different kind of color combination, I would come up with a slightly different base color for a skin tone, and that's what happened between these two paintings. I was also trying to figure out how to layer skin tones and to create the shadows that I wanted. Should I just layer the same color over and over again? Should I add some darker shades so that the shadows are deeper? Or should I don't know. So it was a mixture of those things, and I was kind of experimenting as I went with this one. I found the painting that I did where the tone of the skin was deeper was easier because there is a pre-mixed chocolate brown in this palette, and it was beautiful to use for her skin tone, and I really didn't have to use much variation when it came to mixing. However, with this one I did. I had to figure out how to do a fair tone and then how to deepen it without making it look like too much of a mixture and too deep or too fair. And yeah, it was just a bit of a process. I also wanted to take a second to point out what I meant by how crisp this one turned out looking with the complexion and the shadows in the complexion. I really like how the chest turned out and how the wash and pull technique translated onto this paper compared to the Eraldo di Paolo rough paper. I think it looks much smoother, much more crisp. It's much more the texture that I was going for. So that really influenced my preference when it comes to these two papers that I'm comparing. I jumped around a lot more on this second painting. I waited for it to dry more thoroughly. I was really conscious of that after the first one, and that resulted in me moving around a lot so that I was working on parts of the painting that weren't touching each other. So you might have seen me go from the flesh to the background to her shirt, and then I started on the line art before I had completely finished the painting, which usually I wait until the very end before I start to work on the line art, but I don't know, thought I'd give this a crack, I guess. And here I'm lifting some of the colour, or trying to lift the colour from her fringe, because I hadn't left enough room to put a shine there, and I didn't want the shine to be too dark of a colour, and so I tried to lift some of it. And the way that I did that was, after the colour had been laid down, I got a clean wet brush and I scrubbed at the colour that was there on the page, and that lifted the colour a little bit. And then I tried to dry the brush a bit and go in and lift the water off the page, which would in turn take the pigment up with it. This wasn't a huge success because it's black and black stains pretty heavily, but I think it turned out fine, and I much preferred the hair on this piece compared to the other one because I'd already had a practice, I guess, so I knew what I wanted to change and how I wanted to improve it.
Quarters in my pockets, count 'em like the 4-leaf clovers in my locket. Untied laces, yeah, just tripping on day. Dreams got dirty little lullabies playing on repeat. Might as well just ride around the nursery and count sheep.
So here you can see that I'm leaving out a particular section of the hair that I wanted to turn into another shine, so that she would have two sections going down the right side, or her left, our right side of her head. And I also used a smaller detail brush in order to create finer strands of hair, because I thought that might create some more detail, a little bit more realism, I suppose. Not that my art is particularly realistic, it's kind of cartoony, I suppose, but I do sort of aim for realism, and this is what comes out, I suppose.
The ones who heard my cries and watched me weep. I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.
I also think her eyelashes got a little bit out of hand. They got a bit bigger than I was intending for them to do, a little bit thicker than I was intending for them, and I think that was just because I had a little bit too much paint on my brush. And again, I'm going through with a Posca pen and adding the highlights. I added a few more dots, trying to make it, I don't know, different, trying something new. And then finally I go back through and finish the lineup.
Take my eyes open to force reality. Why can't you just let me eat my weight in glee? I live inside my own
Here's some more peel porn.
belief. Kids screaming in their cradles, profanities. Some days I feel skinnier than
Again, I erased those sides of her shoulders.
sometimes I can't tell if
Signed it with my Instagram tag and my actual signature.
I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe.
Added even more highlights to the eyes, I guess, for some reason. I like how it looks, and yeah, she's done. So here's the finished piece. Close up, you can see all the texture and or lack thereof. And also I have another picture of the warping. This paper warped a little bit more than the Eraldo di Paolo rough, which I was kind of expecting. And off to the outro, so I'll hand you back over to camera Mick.
We're back and I'm done. I've put the papers on the same sides as they were at the beginning of the video. So we've got the Araldo di Paolo on the left and the Strathmore on the right. As you can see, I was right, the paper is the reason for the patchiness. You can see it specifically in the background on this piece, and you can see it down here as well, but that's also my fault. I made the mistake of not waiting till the paint was dry. I thought I had, but I hadn't waited, and it started to bleed a little as well. I made a couple of mistakes on this first one, technically speaking. I forgot to lightly erase the sketch layer as well, so yeah, it was kind of a practice piece, but I do like it still. I like certain features of it better than the other one. I found it easier to blend with the Strathmore paper, and I found the line art easier as well because I had trouble with the texture on the Araldo di Paolo. However, I do like the texture for some certain things, like the background looks really nice, I think, when you have kind of that splotchy consistency. So it works for big washes of colour that you want to look textured, and if that's your style of art, then that works perfectly fine. But for me, I prefer the crispness that I think that I got out of the Strathmore watercolour paper, especially for the skin. I like the smoothness of it. So overall, I'm probably going to lean more towards the Strathmore or just hot press watercolour in general, purely because I think that it's the rough texture that you get out of cold press that I don't necessarily prefer. But I might try some cold press watercolour from other brands in the future just to see if it's this brand in particular or if it is that I just don't like textured watercolour paper. Something else to note that I would recommend if you're going to go out and start painting yourself is, especially with watercolours, the paper is really, really important. I'm sure if you've watched any other art channel, they've said this over and over again, but if you're going to do watercolour, the main thing that will impact the art is the paper. I really didn't think that that was the case at first, but through this experiment and through a couple of others, I have realised that that is the case, and that watercolour is really susceptible to difference based on the paper that you use. So I recommend making sure that you do get a high quality watercolor paper. If you don't mind the texture, this Araldo di Paolo is actually really good quality. Basically all I mean by that is that it is acid free and 100% cotton. If a watercolor paper isn't 100% cotton, it just won't say that on the packaging. If it is 100% cotton, they want you to know about that, so it will be on it. So if it doesn't say 100% cotton, it probably isn't 100% cotton. But yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that. If you have any questions, not that I'm an expert or anything, but if you do have any, I'd be happy to try and answer them if you wanted to comment them. So yeah, I think that's about all I wanted to say. Just a quick reminder to please subscribe and like the video if you liked it, and you can also follow me on my other social medias that are linked in the description down below. Basically my name's the same on everything, and I've recently added a Linktree link into my Instagram so that you can find everything important from there. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye pals.
Hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.